Title 42, a pandemic-era immigration policy, is officially ending. We are going to be discussing what this portends for our southern border. The Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, proposes rules to have airlines pay customers for canceled flights, and some cities in California still ban evictions 3 years after the start of COVID. This is the noteworthy news that you need to know for today, Tuesday, May 9th, 2023. But first, be sure to hit the subscribe button down below and follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Julie R. Hartman. On to this first story. I'm sure many of you have been seeing in the news that Title 42 is ending, and I'm sure even more of you are wondering, what the heck is it? And what does it portend? Well, Title 42 is a pandemic-era policy which permitted the U.S. government to expel immigrants who either A, had COVID, B, exhibited symptoms of COVID, or C, came from countries where the COVID infection rate was particularly high, which of course was basically everywhere. Biden is actually going to repeal this policy in 2 days on May 11th as his administration officially ends the pandemic emergency decree. As context, back in March of 2020, when COVID really spread at its greatest height, the U.S. government declared an emergency period in our history in order to enact certain changes or enforce certain laws that otherwise our government would not have the constitutional power to do. Of course, the most prime example of that was the COVID lockdowns. Now, presidents can usually enact this emergency power during times of war. But what President Donald Trump and subsequently President Joe Biden argued is that COVID was akin to a war as far as its reach and its disruption to the United States and to our world in general. But the reason why this emergency decree has extended, even though COVID was over 3 years ago, or at least started over 3 years ago, is because it is incredibly advantageous for a president to be a president when this emergency decree is in place. Again, this individual can enact certain changes or statutes that he or she otherwise wouldn't have the power to do. An example of this under Biden's administration has been student loan forgiveness. President Biden used his emergency powers in order to say that certain students, those who got federal loans, had to have their student loans forgiven up to a certain amount of money. And he said that the necessity for that was COVID. So that is the reason why it is gone on so long to May of 2023, when it really probably should have ended about 2 years ago. This past Friday, the World Health Organization officially ended its COVID-19 emergency decree. So back to Title 42. Under this policy, according to the Biden administration, authorities have expelled migrants at our southern border, the U.S.-Mexico border, more than 2.8 million times. Now that's interesting. They say 2.8 million times. They don't say that 2.8 million people have been expelled, but then they use this term times. It raises the question, what does that mean? Does it mean that people were expelled and then they were able to come back in? Does it mean that they were supposed to be expelled, or there was sort of an order declaring that they must leave, but they didn't end up leaving? It's a bit dubious, but according to the Biden administration, it's been used 2.8 million times to turn away or expel migrants at the U.S. border. This is according to U.S. Customs and Border Protection data. But what we do know is that the Department of Homeland Security has said that over 5 million undocumented immigrants have crossed into the United States via our southern border since President Biden took office back in January of 2021. That is astounding that in just over, or I guess 2.5 years, that many people came into the United States. Also, according to the Department of Homeland Security, all of those 5 million undocumented immigrants were not tested for COVID-19. So again, it raises the question, was Title 42 particularly effective if 5 million undocumented, untested for COVID immigrants came across our border during that time? Some argue, no, that Title 42 wasn't effective, and some argue that as many people came through our border, there would actually have been more had Title 42 not be in place. not have been in place, excuse me. And there are many worries that once Title 42 is officially repealed on May 11th, then there is going to be a surge at the southern border of people coming into the United States who no longer fear being expelled under this rule. Actually, interestingly, during the days leading up to this repeal of Title 42, i.e. right now, there is a surge already happening of people at the southern border. In other words, they're not waiting until after May 11th because many migrants fear that the Biden administration, once Title 42 is repealed, will enact other measures that will keep a certain amount of migrants from coming in. So it seems that there's a surge before this repeal. There will probably be a surge after this repeal. And the takeaway from it, of course, is that our southern border continues to be a large issue. We are seeing many migrants not only go to cities on the southern part of our country, but we are seeing people such as New York City's Mayor Eric Adams and Chicago's Mayor Lori Lightfoot saying that even those cities, which are up north, are experiencing and seeing an influx of migrants that is just an untenable number for the city to properly take care of. The Biden administration did say that they are anticipating a surge of border crossings after the repeal of Title 42, and they have said that they will deploy 1,500 troops at the southern border in order to mitigate such a surging. And they also have announced their plans to open migrant processing centers in countries like Colombia and Guatemala. On to the second news story of today, which could be some good news. Airlines may have to pay for canceled flights under a new proposed policy by our Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. He announced yesterday that he has proposed new rules that airlines will have to reimburse customers who incur hotel, meal, and transportation expenses due to certain delayed or canceled flights. That is, flights that have been delayed more than 3 hours or flights that were canceled for what Secretary Buttigieg calls, quote, a controllable reason. This comes amid some airline catastrophes or near catastrophes that have plagued our air system and also really just sort of the transportation system in the United States in general over the past few months. To rattle off a few examples, last month, that is April, in case those of you don't know what month it is now, I sometimes forget, FYI. Last month, April, half of flights in the Southwest Airlines were delayed amid, quote, data connection issues. Of course, back in December, Southwest Airlines experienced another terrible bout of trouble when they had a system meltdown that resulted in 16,700 canceled flights during Christmas time. That just pertains to Southwest. There have been many other troubles with regard to other airlines. For instance, this past December 2022, there was that famous United flight that was taking off from San Francisco to Maui, which got about 775 feet above sea level, nearly plunging into the Pacific Ocean. And since the start of this year, again, if you don't know what year it is, it's 2023, there was an FAA system shutdown in the early weeks of the year, which affected all air transportation. At LA International Airport, a bus and an American Airlines jet crashed into one another, sending 4 people to the hospital. Also, a Southwest flight and a FedEx flight nearly collided. They came within about 1,000 feet of crashing into each other at Austin's Bergstrom International Airport. There was another near collision at JFK International Airport in New York, where a Delta flight that was taking off almost hit an American Airlines flight that moved in front of the Delta plane. And finally, of course, this doesn't pertain to air travel, but train travel. There have been several Norfolk Southern train derailments, the most famous of which happened back in February in East Palestine, Ohio, which exposed several tens of tons of toxic chemicals. So it seems to be, on the surface, perhaps a good thing that our Secretary of Transportation is encouraging or trying to enact this measure that will penalize airlines for canceling flights or delaying flights. This may encourage or make it more likely for airlines to reverse some of the woke rules that they have implemented. For instance, back in 2021, United Airlines announced that half of its pilots will be women or people of color. They say that this is to upend the white male-dominated pilot world. So this policy may have an effect of causing those airlines not to engage in those woke policies. That being said, it does appear that some of the issues that airlines have been encountering may not be their faults. Actually, it may be the fault of our Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, who is indeed the one proposing this new rule. I have mentioned on this show several times, because it is so emblematic of individuals in the Biden administration, and especially Secretary Buttigieg, that one of his first acts of coming into office as our Secretary of Transportation was to rename the Notice to Air Man system, which is essentially the system that sort of coordinates air traffic. He renamed that from Notice to Air Man system to Notice to Air Mission system, because men apparently is a no-no bad word. So when that is his priority, instead of, I don't know, making airline travel run correctly, it doesn't seem like he is doing a lot to help the airline industry. Also, Regional Airline Association CEO Fair Markley Black told members of the U.S. House of Representatives Transportation and Infrastructure Committee that over 50%, this is staggering, over 50% of current pilots will be forced to retire within the next 15 years. This is because we have federal rules that say that pilots over the age of 65 can no longer be pilots. They have to retire. Only 8% of pilots currently in the United States are below the age of 30, in large part due to the high cost of flight education. So instead of raising the age at which pilots are forced to retire, as has been proposed, Pete Buttigieg has actually opposed this legislation, saying, and this specifically, this legislation, there was a proposal that would increase the retirement threshold to 67 years of age instead of 65 years of age. Our Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, opposed this, saying, quote, "The answer is to make sure we have as many and as good of pilots ready to take their place, to have a stronger pipeline than to raise the age." That may be a legitimate point, but in the meantime, if we are going to be experiencing a shortage, especially such a drastic shortage of pilots, then we may have to raise the age at which pilots must be forced to retire. So the point is, although this policy may be a good one, that is to require airlines to incur some expenses because of canceled flights, also airlines do need more support from someone who is more focused on making things run properly than renaming technology so that it can be politically correct. And on to our final news story of today. Apparently, several California cities, such as San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, and even parts of Los Angeles, are still enforcing laws that protect tenants from eviction or rent increases. Along with Title 42, this eviction moratorium is a COVID, or I should say lockdown, era policy in order to protect some people who had been laid off from their jobs. The argument went that because of lockdowns, people were laid off, and so there should be a temporary hold on their rent in order to prevent those individuals from being evicted and thus becoming homeless. Another stated reason of both the federal and state government, federal government and state governments, I should say, was to prevent the spread of COVID. The argument went that you wanted people to stay in their homes instead of be thrown out onto the street and possibly spreading the virus. So again, there could be some legitimate arguments that for a time at the beginning of the pandemic, maybe this was an okay course of action. It actually seems that it wasn't, because although the people who are the tenants of such apartments may be benefiting from not having to pay rent, the people who own the apartment buildings need to pay rent themselves and need to support their own families. And it's not fair to them to have their tenants not paying them. But 3 years later, the fact that this is still continuing is really astonishing. Now, the Trump administration did enact a nationwide pandemic eviction ban near the start of the pandemic, but the Supreme Court overturned it in 2021. But at the time of the policy, nearly half of apartment tenants in the United States were nationally protected under this law, and the federal government actually doled out $47 billion in federal rental assistance. So, as I said, there are a few cities in California that have extended these eviction moratoriums into the summer. For instance, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors recently voted to maintain an eviction ban for unpaid rent until at least the end of the summer of 2023. Meanwhile, the city of Los Angeles has extended a prohibition on evicting tenants for having unauthorized pets or occupants in their apartments. So they're just making it hard for someone to be kicked out of their apartments. Also, the city of Los Angeles alone is doling out $24 million in rental assistance. That is in addition to the federal government number of rental assistance that I just told you about. But that is really a meager sum of money compared to the fact that unpaid rent across the greater Los Angeles area over the time from the start of the pandemic to now is over $1 billion. Now, our Los Angeles mayor, Karen Bass, defended this decision to extend the eviction moratorium by saying, we work to bring Angelenos inside, as we work to bring Angelenos inside, we also have to work to prevent Angelenos from falling into homelessness. Now, Scott Brody is a property manager who oversees a portfolio of about 3,000 apartments here in Los Angeles. And he said to the Wall Street Journal that it is actually really hard to evict tenants because the government doesn't enforce it really. A property owner can send a notice of eviction to a tenant, but often, according to Mr. Brody, tenants defy this, and they know that the police or other members of the government that would enforce such a thing are not as willing to do so amid this sort of in vogue idea that tenants should be able to stay in their apartments at all costs. When one reads a story like this, you cannot help but be surprised that 3 out of the 4 largest bank collapses in U.S. history happened within the past 6 weeks. That is the Silicon Valley Bank, the First Republic Bank, and Signature Bank. When we are just handing out money, stimulus checks, preventing the economy from working right, people paying their rent, that accumulates, that adds up. That is the reason for our inflation, our high interest rates, and of course, our continuing and ever being exacerbated economic woes. Thank you very much for joining me today. And as a reminder, check out my show Timeless, which is on the Timeless playlist of this YouTube channel. I'll see you soon.